Hey everyone, here we are with part 4 of chapter 20, the final part to all of this. Communities and Ecosystems part 4, dealing with ecosystems. So, we discussed ecosystems briefly before, and we said that ecosystems are the most complex level of the biological hierarchy. So this is now the broadest kind of level, unless we're discussing the biosphere, which is of course all of planet Earth. And that's where you would look at things that are really global in nature, phenomena such as an El Nino event that takes a phenomenon that happens off the coast of Australia all the way across the Pacific, and then we experience it in California. But that's something that's really hard to pinpoint in many ways. And so when we're dealing with an ecosystem, at least we have a more direct way of dealing with how the ecosystem works. So the first thing to note is what is included. Well, we just came from the community ecology level, and now we're adding abiotic factors to it, which means that now we're not only layering on complexity because we're looking at the entire ecosystem, but we're also now including factors that the organisms themselves do not influence. And so that's clearly something that's an added layer to the whole thing. But of course, we're also going to ask different questions. We're going to look at this in different ways. One thing to look at is energy flow. Energy flow simply means how does the energy come into the ecosystem? What does it do in the ecosystem? And how does it leave the ecosystem? And tied into that also is chemical cycling, which is how are the chemicals, the building blocks that all organisms are made of, how are they tied into this entire system? So it's very important to differentiate the two, but they are related, as you'll see in the next slide. So when you're looking at an ecosystem as an example, and this particular one is something that you can buy in some stores. I've seen these on the shelves. There are these little cubes, and inside is a complete ecosystem. And this ecosystem has in it plants, that's the producer level, and it has in it various types of little organisms, and then it has the decomposers in it. It's enriched. The whole thing is a completely independent system. If you make sure that it doesn't overheat, so don't put it right in the sun in the window, but if you leave it on a shelf where normally you have day and night lighting, then it should work just fine and last for many, many years. Anyway, here's how this works. So we start over here on the left, clearly, with light energy. And light energy is where it all starts for us in terms of energy. That is how energy comes into planet Earth. And as we know, photosynthesis is what turns it into chemical energy. So that's one key thing that happens, is that the transition from light energy to chemical energy. Now, the plants have that chemical energy, so now organisms can eat the plant. So there is your organism, and this organism can eat the plant. And because of the activity of cellular respiration in both the animal and in the plant, a little bit of heat is released because of the second law of thermodynamics. So this is the kind of thing that tells us about how the energy flows through. But of course, there are added things. There are all these chemicals that have to be in there. And the chemicals also cycle. So for example, water has to cycle. Carbon has to cycle. We have different other kinds of elements, including phosphorus and nitrogen. They all have to cycle through this, and we couldn't do it without the contribution of certain bacteria, protists, and fungi. That's to complete the cycle, to return the matter that organisms have used and can no longer use because the organisms die. Those can then be recycled and returned to the system. And that's why this little cube works so well, is because it has all those components in it. So when we're now dealing with transferring material from different organisms, then of course you can think about, well, how do I get my energy? Well, you eat food, clearly that's how you do it. And if that's one key way, then all other animals that are dependent on a producer, a plant, they would do the same thing. And then maybe when you transfer the rest of your energy after you die, that goes back to the environment as well. So there are many different ways, many different levels at which energy gets transferred. The main thing is, though, energy doesn't just sit there. Energy is something that always moves through an environment. It moves in and through the ecosystem, and because it flows in and through, it always needs to be replenished. I think that's pretty straightforward. Chemical cycling then involves the environment in terms of the non-living components as well as the living components. So we have biogeochemical cycles. The bio part involves the biotic components, so that would be organisms, plants, you and I. And then we have the geo, those are the abiotic components. And geo, when we think of geology, for example, we think of rocks, but it simply really means it's an abiotic component. In some case, that is rocks, but in some case, it's something else. So when you're looking at these biogeochemical cycle, when you put it all together, you'll find that each of those cycles, each particular substance that needs to cycle, has an abiotic reservoir. Clearly, before planet Earth began, there were no living organisms on planet Earth, and therefore everything was abiotic. So that means the origin of all the things that we're seeing today must at some point, this is just pure logic, have been abiotic. And some of the cycling actually requires geological processes. So some of the ways in which we obtain these substances comes primarily from interactions that have nothing to do with organisms. And that's something interesting. So we do have this abiotic resource that the planet provides, and then we can use a lot of these kinds of things as they enter the cycles. Now, some of these cycles aren't very straightforward. Some of them require a lot of processing and a lot of energy so that you can switch between the biological, the organic components, and those that are in the rocks. Those would be the inorganic ones. And so it's very interesting how this works. So we have these two giant cycling things. We have this energy cycle, or the energy flow, and then we have the flow of chemicals. Now, when you look at this in terms of a generalized theme, and I don't quite know where to put myself here. Let's put myself way up here. The generalized scheme looks something like this. So first of all, let's start with this abiotic reservoir, because that's where it ultimately comes from. And now we're building the cycle. And you can see at the top, there are many arrows here, many different arrows. And so let's start with the one at the bottom, because that's the simpler one. The abiotic reservoir cycles through geologic processes. So the geologic processes are things that can happen only with the abiotic reservoir. No organisms needed. So there is some type of cycling that happens with these abiotic reservoirs that doesn't require any organisms. So now we add the organisms to it. And the first step is going to be making the nutrients available to producers. Once we make them available to the producers, and these usually are plants or other photosynthetic organisms, then we can take those nutrients up into the producers, and from the producers then of course they go into the consumers. That would be you and I. And so when we're looking at the nutrients as they move up in a food chain like this, then that makes complete sense. This is how we all obtain our food. And then the leftovers of the consumers and the producers is going to be moved through the decomposers. And that is the first little cycle, right? So you start with the abiotic reservoir, and here are the nutrients provided by the abiotic reservoir. Now these nutrients are going to cycle either to the producers, to the decomposers, and back. So there's your little cycle right here. That's a biogeochemical cycle here, but this is all in the bio part. So we're not quite there. This is all bio, and then if we go all the way up to the consumers and then to the decomposer, this is also all bio. But we still have to return to the geo, and that's where all of these, the decomposers, the producers and the consumers are able to put these nutrients back into the abiotic reservoir. So you can see there's multiple things that can happen. There's little cycles within cycles, and yet this large-scale cycle where everything goes back through the abiotic reservoir is also important to replenish. Let's take a look at one of these cycles. A pretty straightforward one, I think, the carbon cycle, and you may already be familiar with this because we've been talking about carbon and CO2 and greenhouse gases and so on, and we'll do so again in a few minutes. But if you're looking, for example, at the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that is your geological, your abiotic reservoir. So the carbon is basically in the atmosphere. That is the small molecule, the inorganic molecule that things begin with. Now we move that, of course, through photosynthesis into plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. This is number one down here. And then from there, it goes into the primary consumers. There's your rabbit. The higher level consumer, that could be you and I. This could be the bobcat here. And then through cellular respiration, it goes back up into the atmosphere. So there's your little cycle like that. But then we can expand the cycle by including detritus. And of course, this means that the plants die, the animals die, the animals produce waste. And so a lot of the carbon becomes detritus again. So some of the carbon is pumped back into the atmosphere through our cellular respiration. You breathe out, out goes the carbon dioxide. Or any of the waste that we produce. Let's say that you eat on a daily basis, there's going to be some stuff coming out the other end, right? And that is the waste. And that waste becomes the detritus. And these are the products, the detritus, that the decomposers, the soil microbes, are dealing with. And this is one of the things that's remarkable because humans have made use of this when we're clearing up water, used water, for example. There are various kinds of microbes that are used to clean all the garbage, clean all the detritus out of our water supply. So yes, there's filtration, but you can also literally digest that stuff. It takes a little while, but that's how you can refresh the drinking water. And then, as we already talked about in chapter 6, we have this added amount of carbon that's coming now into the atmosphere from wood and fossil fuels. So this is basically what the carbon cycle looks like. The nitrogen cycle, as another example, is very similar, because we do have a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So that, once again, is our abiotic resource. So when it comes to the geo part, it's not in the rocks, it's actually in the atmosphere. And this then does similar things. So the kind of interesting thing here about nitrogen is that the only way we can access it is not through plants, but through plants that have nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So we need bacteria to get the nitrogen, which we need for making proteins and making nucleic acids. It's remarkable. We need to have these microbes. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get the nitrogen. We have this process called nitrogen fixation. And these root nodules and the free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they're the ones who are allowing us to get the nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and it's able to put it into the soil. Now once it's in the soil, now we have to follow the numbers. We go this pathway. So we have the nitrifying bacteria, and those produce nitrates. Now some of you who know a little bit about agriculture may know that when you have fertilizers, fertilizers are nitrates basically, and these nitrates then can feed our plants. Or you can have denitrifying bacteria. So that's the opposite end. How do you put it back up into the atmosphere? It's through denitrifying bacteria. Now the plants pick this up. There are of course lots of organic molecules that come out of this. The plant gets eaten by the animal, and so now the nitrogen is transferred to the animal. And then once again, as before with carbon, we have decomposition. The waste, the detritus decomposition goes back into the soil, And of course, some of this can then be used as plant food again. You know that natural fertilizer, something like cow dung, camel dung, those kinds of things are actually used in agriculture. There are occasions when basically farmers spread the cow dung all over their fields because it helps with fertilization. So that's the nitrogen cycle. It's different in some ways from the carbon cycle because the only way we can get nitrogen is from bacteria, and the only way it goes back out into the atmosphere is through bacteria. But other than that, you can see once again there are little cycles within the bigger cycle. Now clearly, since there are so many moving parts of this, humans can have an impact on chemical cycles. Of course, we have an impact on almost anything. But because the human activities are nowadays so pronounced in certain cycles, we do have a significant impact here. So, for example, artificially high levels of carbon dioxide. This is what we discussed in chapter 6, where I said that, it appears that instead of just raising the productivity of the whole carbon cycle, some of the carbon that comes in from fossil fuels does not all get assimilated, does not all get absorbed, but it stays in the atmosphere. I don't think anybody really has satisfactorily answered why that is, except that, as I mentioned, where the carbon dioxide is produced makes a difference. And if where it is produced, there aren't enough facilities, natural facilities to bring it in, to absorb it, well then where does it go? So if you look at an inner city that produces a huge amount of carbon dioxide on a daily basis, there just isn't enough plant matter that can pick it all up. And then where does it go? So this is, of course, one of the problems. But we also have a problem with fertilization. So if you use non-natural fertilizers, that means you're going beyond what you would normally find on a farm, let's say. We have sewage and fertilizers artificially that change the natural nitrogen balance. And what's worse, not only do we put the fertilizers on the fields, and that is of course where they can be useful, increasing our production of agricultural goods, that would be fine, but we over-fertilize. We over-fertilize, and we sometimes fertilize during certain periods where a lot of the molecules that are brought in by the fertilizer don't get into the ground, don't get into the plant, but they run off. So if you have fertilized and there's a torrential rain right after, well, there just hasn't been enough time for everything to seep into the ground and be picked up. And instead it gets washed into a stream, and the stream carries it to the river, and the river carries it to the ocean. And then you end up with large quantities of nitrates that you really didn't want to be in the rivers or the oceans in the first place. This also, of course, can increase the productivity of certain types of organisms in ponds and lakes, and you don't want that either. You have these massive algal blooms, and the algae aren't really the ones that you want to have that much productivity, because not many organisms use them. There's many other things that these algae then outgrow, and so there's competition, and of course that's then a problem. We also, of course, have industrial and residential water consumption, and if you're in California, you are acutely aware of some of these issues. There are other places in the United States where excessive water consumption, and primarily because of agriculture, has drained aquifers. There are some large aquifers in parts of Texas, for example, and they're being depleted. And everything that lives off of these aquifers and the natural cycling of water now has a different amount of water available. So at the one hand, we're decreasing the water that's in the ground, but we're increasing the water that's in the atmosphere, because we're using so much water to put out on the land. And this, of course, could be in terms of agriculture. It could be in terms of our own water consumption. There's now a lot more water vapor than there would naturally be. So these are some key issues when we're dealing with that. And then lastly, we deal with a variety of minerals that we are removing from the places where they would ordinarily become part of the abiotic geochemical cycle. And so we're removing them where they could potentially be washed into the environment, and as a consequence, you're going to have a change in the soil chemistry. So there are a lot of these kinds of things. This is a little bit of a recurring problem. We had this kind of problem before when we're dealing with communities, when we discussed how certain human activities disrupt how organisms work in their environment. We talked about habitat fragmentation and various challenges like that. And here it comes again, but now in this case with the chemical cycles. So we have already discussed fossil fuels, and so I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, but if we're using fossil fuels, we're digging up things that have been in the ground for millions of years. They are the dead organisms. So if you think of coal and oil and gas, those are derived from forests that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. And the author Tim Flannery basically says it's like digging up the dead. Don't do it. It's not nice. And ultimately, those kinds of things, the oil, natural gas, and coal derived from these carboniferous forests, those basically have caused these increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And now we're starting to see the impact on a lot of the things that we have produced. So it's a problem if your inner city suddenly is working at much higher temperatures because people will overheat. It's a problem if you need so much energy to cool things down that you're depleting your energy sources. And so this is kind of a spiraling effect. And as a consequence, we end up with global warming. So climate change and global warming are, of course, related. Now, I have to say, and I've already told you, I've said it again, the scientific evidence for this is crystal clear. Like, there's no argument over this. There's no argument that there is global warming, and there is no argument that we are the cause of the level of global warming we see. There have been global warming events in the past, and global warming then has occurred over a period of millions of years. Now we're dealing with measurable global warming in a period of dozens of years. Millions of years versus dozens of years. And the only change ultimately is what we, the humans, have built. So therefore, that must be caused by humans. It's very clear when you consider it that way. I will also repeat some of this because it's useful to have that in mind when we're dealing with these cycles. Carbon dioxide emissions have increased dramatically. You remember the Keeling curve, and that's what this is. That's the amount of carbon dioxide that's been increasing rapidly since it was started to be measured by Charles Keeling in the late 1950s. But we have certainly increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it is beyond natural fluctuations. One of the reasons why I say that is because that curve is so nice and smooth. If you're trying to find other places where there are carbon dioxide emissions, things like volcanic eruptions or spontaneous releases of various types of carbons, they do happen periodically, but they're never enough to even make a dent in that curve. That curve is so nice and smooth, and nature just isn't so nice and smooth. I mean, volcanoes aren't so nice and regular. Earthquakes aren't so nice and regular, yet this curve is very nice and very regular. And so the second part of it is that even if you're going to places that don't appear to have much in the way of human impact, you see that this is occurring, and therefore it's a global phenomenon. This is the Keeling curve. I put that in here again. Of course, I gave you a slightly updated version in the earlier chapter when we talked about chapter 6 in cellular respiration. So this is where you have the little annual cycle, because northern hemisphere has more trees than southern hemisphere, and so you can see that there is less carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere when it's cold in the north. But by and large, other than these minor fluctuations, this is pretty much as smooth a curve as you can produce. And to think about it, that this occurs on a global scale, that's pretty mind-boggling. So that's the Keeling curve. Now, the one thing that is problematic about this is that the carbon emissions have been accelerating. It is true that since 2000, where this slide ends, there have been some really, really strong efforts to prevent carbon emissions from accelerating. But accelerating means speed up. We want to actually reduce them altogether. And it is therefore really interesting to note how this has happened in different regions. So let's start with the US and Canada. That's the brown line. So here we have the brown line, and you can see that there was a limit to these emissions and they went down. Well, this is of course Great Depression, and you had the Second World War, and so some of these emissions went down because there was less activity. But then industrial activity picked up, and with some minor fluctuations, you can see that they have increased dramatically. Million metric tons of carbon per year. Let's compare this to Western Europe, the second curve here. Western Europe had higher carbon emissions sooner because Western Europe is where the Industrial Revolution began. There's another little point that shows that humans have something to do with this. The Industrial Revolution began, and so the emissions were higher in Europe than they were in North America. That makes sense. And then during the war years, you had the same kind of thing, and then, of course, right at the end of the war, there was a significant drop because the countries were basically at the bottom. So you had these fluctuations, and then the run-up, and then the Second World War. And then things increased and increased and increased. And then in the 1970s, the Europeans, the Western Europeans in those days, they realized, uh-oh, we got to do something about this. We have to reduce what we do. So not only do we limit the ways we deal with carbon emissions, we want to reduce them. And as you can see here, since the 1970s, even with increasing population sizes and increasing use of automobiles, the line has gone flat. So the carbon emissions in Western Europe are flat. That's interesting, because it means that these economies have grown, and some of them have grown just as fast as those in the United States or Canada, but they have been able to curb their carbon emissions. Now, they haven't reduced them from that point, but they have been able to curb them. Similar kinds of things, if you look at Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states, so there was an increase, then there is the little fluctuation with the Second World War, huge run-up, and then when the Berlin Wall fell and communism fell, this line went dramatically down. Now, it went down for two reasons. One, because clearly those countries lost productivity. The way those economies were driven were very much for economic output, without regard for the environment, without regard for people. But then the Western European guidelines and standards were imposed in Eastern Europe. And of course, that immediately brought down the level of carbon emissions, because now they had to use the kind of things that the Western Europeans were using. And that's what you have in the European Union. So you now see that this yellow line basically ends up slightly below where the Western European line is. And now, of course, we can combine these lines since we have Western and Eastern Europe back together in a way. And then there are the others, and we can do similar kinds of things. We have Asia, strong increases, and then in recent years when China has basically realized, okay, we're doing a lot of polluting here, we need to change something, that was important. And then we have India and Southeast Asia. Well, India and Southeast Asia, they're still going up because they are increasing their productivity. After decolonization, after these countries became independent, that's that light green line, they started to ramp up their productivity, which is basically what the Europeans and the Americans did. So ramp up productivity and try to build a better economy so that you can support your population. So this is, of course, all adding up to a challenge. We do want to support our population, We do want to make sure that the carbon emissions are in check, and in fact, we have the technology now so that we can decrease carbon emissions. We have that technology. We have it in place, and it's not going to ruin us as a nation and as an economy. That's just fear-mongering, because these other economies, as I've talked to you at the beginning of chapter 6, they've already done a lot of these kinds of things. So this is obviously the challenge, one of the big challenges of our time. Now, the greenhouse effect itself is something that's relatively easy to understand. When you're looking at why this is like a greenhouse. Now, think about a greenhouse. A greenhouse is basically a glass structure, glass or plastic, and it holds in the gases and it holds in the heat. The Earth is like a greenhouse, if you will, because things don't just leave the Earth. So here you have on the left, you have light coming in, and this light enters the atmosphere. And once it hits the ground, then of course we're going to get some of the wavelengths that they're going into the plants, but not all of them. And here is what the problem is. The short wavelengths, they come into the atmosphere, and once they bounce off, they're now longer wavelengths. These squiggles aren't very good. These squiggles should be much shorter, so there should be like a lot of squiggling, and these should be longer squiggles, because the longer ones, they can't get out. That's one of the key problems. And as a consequence of having more heat kept, because the heat is being kept in by the atmosphere and by the molecules in the atmosphere, the more molecules we add to the atmosphere, the more of the heat is being kept in. So that is the conundrum. And then at the end, basically, even though photosynthesis normally can remove this carbon dioxide, now it cannot, because we're dealing with accumulating carbon dioxide, deforestation, habitat destruction, and so on. And what are we going to do? Right? So this is how the greenhouse gases are shaping our environment. We don't know exactly where this is going to leave us, but of course you have heard many of the predictions, and we have these COP meetings annually now. These are the ones where we're trying to figure out how's carbon in the atmosphere and what does it mean for us. We are starting to see some of the effects. We know this because we've had temperature spikes, we've had storms when there used to never be any, we've had all these different things that occur, glaciers melting, etc., etc. We know that this is going on, and we suspect that this is going to be a significant problem in the years to come. Now, what are we doing about it? Well, we're trying to limit the emissions. We're trying to keep the temperature, the warming, below a certain level. And fingers crossed, hopefully that works. Ultimately, it's not just dealing with cars and airplanes and so on. Those are important, but they're really only less than 20% of the problem. The big problem is energy production. And if we don't get away from energy production without fossil fuels, then we're going to have probably, a future that looks a little bit more like what you're seeing in this picture. Not very exciting, and with the loss of lots of organisms. I have a couple of links here. You can write those down. You can watch these. I think that they're still good. I haven't tested them again, but this is something that you should consider. And as a consequence of all this, we really have to work on sustainable development. And this is something that I've mentioned to you in person and in the lab. We need to deal with what I call proper planetary stewardship. I mean, stewardship is one of the things it's religious, right? I mean, it does say that we need stewardship. All major religions have an aspect of that in them. And so ultimately, if we are optimally developing the biosphere, which we can do and should do, because we as humans have, ways that we can work together and we can work with the animals and plants that surround us, but it means that we need to take on more of a caretaker function. Currently, we're primarily exploiters. And even though there are undercurrents, the sort of the grassroots movement that says we need to have better functions, I think part of the big problem is that we're always after growth. But maybe instead of focusing on growth, we need to focus on what actually works and at what level. So let's say that the human population taps out at the top at maybe 10 billion, maybe 11 billion, billion with a B. then, well, right now we're at 8. We increase by 2 or 3 billion, but then that's going to be it, and we're not expecting growth beyond that. So that would then allow us to take a step back and say, okay, well, how do we deal with these many people, and how can we have them work together and deal with an environment that is suitable for not only humans and all humans, no matter who they are, but that's also suitable for the organisms that ultimately sustain us. If you keep cutting trees, you're not going to have the energy in the environment, because that's where it comes from. You're going to have more problems with carbon dioxide. And right now we don't have any technology that can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere the way trees can. So my take on this is that as our species, Homo sapiens, as we prosper, then all the other organisms in the environments that support us should be prospering as well. We know how to do this. And for some of this, we really do have technology. We have technology that instead of having huge fields, you can put things one above the other. That's, dealing with hydroponics, for example. We can be much more efficient in how we grow things rather than have these huge swaths of land occupied by agriculture. We are much better now at the way we were. And so we have had a lot of research in this issue, but we just haven't applied it. And it's not because it's more expensive to do things like, the way it should be done. It's simply different. And people don't like change. If you have done certain things the way you always done them and it worked fine, then that's what you want to do. And you're afraid that the change is going to cost you, or it's going to bring something that you don't want. And so we sometimes need to accept that we now have to change. And sustainable development is something we as consumers must demand. If it's not from sustainable sources, don't buy it. That's what I would say. This is not only an issue in the food industry. This is also dealing with clothing, dealing with mattresses, dealing with anything that uses natural products for us, for our purposes. And so that's it. We have reached the end. I hope that it was a fun journey for you, as it was for me, as it is for me every semester. And I wish you well, and I'll see you on the trail.